Carol O'Shea had the window seat, the one she always took when she could get it, and she was already 3 pages into her magazine before the man settled into 2A. She noticed him the way you notice anyone who moves like they have nowhere to be in a hurry, which on a boarding flight, where everyone else was loading bags and checking phones and angling for overhead space, made him stand out. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his late 50s, with close-cropped gray at his temples and a face that had spent a long time in the sun. He wore dark slacks and a plain blue button-down, no tie, no logo. He stowed a small canvas bag in the overhead without ceremony and sat down. And when he sat down, he was simply still, in a way Carol couldn't quite name. Not restless still, the way people sit when they're forcing themselves to be calm, genuinely still. He folded his hands on his knee and looked ahead, and that was the entirety of it. Carol went back to her magazine. The attendant's name was Brees Hartwell. Carol had noticed him earlier at the forward galley. Young, mid-30s, dark uniform pressed sharp, and there was something about the way he moved through the cabin that suggested he had decided, some years ago, that the authority of his position was a larger thing than it actually was. He stopped at row 2, the way a man stops when he has already decided what he is going to find there. "I'll need to see your boarding pass, sir." The man in 2A looked up, not startled, as if he had been expecting the interruption and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. He reached into his shirt pocket, produced the pass, and held it out. Hartwell took it, examined it longer than the scanner at the gate had bothered to do, and handed it back. "And a secondary form of ID?" Carol stopped reading. The man in 2A, she did not yet know his name, turned his head toward Hartwell with an expression Carol would spend the rest of the flight trying to describe. It was not anger, it was not surprise. It was the look of a man who has been asked a great many unreasonable things in his life and has long since stopped being surprised by them. He reached into his jacket, produced a government-issued photo ID, held it out. Hartwell looked at it, looked back at the man, looked at the ID again. "Everything check out?" the man said. His voice was low and level, and he said it the way someone says something they already know the answer to. Hartwell handed the ID back without answering and moved forward. Carol exhaled. She hadn't known she was holding her breath, and found her place on the page again. 3 minutes later, Hartwell was back. He was back, and he had changed somehow, gotten tighter, and Carol heard, from across the aisle, a woman's voice low and urgent, the woman in 3B, blonde, pearls, speaking to him with the practiced insistence of someone accustomed to being listened to. Carol couldn't hear everything. She caught uncomfortable, and "you don't know who," and "I don't feel safe," and the particular tone of a person who knows how to make a complaint feel like a favor. Hartwell returned to row 2. He stood in the aisle and looked down at the man in 2A, with an expression Carol recognized too. The expression of a person who has just been handed a reason to do what they wanted to do anyway. "Sir, I need to ask you to come with me." The man in 2A did not move. He looked at Hartwell with the same level gaze he had used for the ID check. "Where?" "We have a seating adjustment to make. There's a seat available in the main cabin. I have a first-class ticket. There's been a passenger concern. For your comfort and the comfort of others, we're going to ask you to—" "I have a first-class ticket," the man said again. He said it the same way both times, the same words, the same register, as though he had an infinite supply of that sentence and intended to use each one exactly once. "My name is Darnell O'Shea. The seat is assigned to me. I'll wait while you verify." He folded his hands back on his knee. Carol looked at him over the top of her magazine, and then looked at her magazine, and understood she was not going to read another word of it. She thought about saying something. She was in the adjacent seat. She could see, with a clarity that made her vaguely sick, what was happening and why it was happening. She was a 63-year-old woman with a round face and reading glasses, and she had never in her life been asked for a secondary form of ID before she sat down, and the man next to her had been asked in the first 2 minutes. She thought about saying something, and she did not say it. Hartwell had called for the co-pilot. That was what the second attendant, younger, visibly uncomfortable, hovering at the edge of the galley, had relayed to the row. Carol heard the second attendant say something about escalating the situation, and something about co-pilot's discretion, and she watched Darnell O'Shea listen to this news and nod, once, as if it was precisely the response he had anticipated. He did not get up. He did not raise his voice. He sat in seat 2A with his hands on his knee, and he waited. And the cabin, which had gone very quiet in the specific way a cabin goes quiet when the people in it know something is wrong and have agreed, collectively, not to say so, waited with him. The door to the cockpit corridor opened. He was a white man, mid-50s, in the uniform of a co-pilot, the 4 stripes, the jacket, the kind of bearing that comes from 25 years of being the calmest person in any emergency. He walked down the aisle with the measured pace of someone who had been told there was a passenger situation and expected to find one. He was reading the row numbers as he came. He reached row 2, and he stopped. He stopped completely. Not the stop of a man finding what he came for, the stop of a man who has just seen something he was not prepared to see. He stood in the aisle and looked at the man in seat 2A, and something moved across his face, something Carol watched happen and couldn't name until much later, when she thought about it in the taxi home and recognized it as relief. "Master Sergeant Osei," the co-pilot said. The man in 2A looked up at him. For just a moment, the first moment since he had sat down, the stillness in his face broke open into something else, something quiet and unguarded, the kind of look you don't mean anyone to see. Then it settled again. "Marcus," he said. The co-pilot, Carol would learn his name later. Learn it the way you learn names on a flight where something has happened. His name was Webb, Marcus Webb, Lieutenant Colonel. Rhett stood in the aisle of Pelham Continental Flight 304 and turned to look at Brees Hartwell with an expression that needed no translation. "This man," Webb said, and he said it to Hartwell and to the second attendant and to the woman in 3B and to everyone in the forward cabin who had gone quiet enough to hear him, served 22 years in the United States Army. He reached the rank of Master Sergeant in Special Forces. He was decorated 4 times, including a Distinguished Service Medal for actions I watched him perform with my own eyes. He paused. "I know, because I was the junior officer on his team. He pulled me out of a burning vehicle in Kandahar in 2007, and I have thought about that morning every day since." The cabin was absolutely silent. "He has a first-class ticket," Webb continued. His voice had not risen. It was the voice of a man who had learned, long ago, that the quieter you speak, the more carefully people listen. "He is sitting in his assigned seat, and I would like someone to tell me, very specifically, what the nature of the concern is." Hartwell did not answer. Carol found, to her embarrassment, that she needed a moment. She pressed 2 fingers to her mouth and looked at the oval window and thought, "You were sitting right there, and you did not say a word." She set down her magazine and said, "He was asked for a second ID before we even pushed back. Just him." She had not planned it. But she had said it, and she watched Hartwell turn toward her, recalibrate, and find nothing to say to a 63-year-old white woman with reading glasses who was telling him a plain fact. The second attendant had already moved toward the front of the aircraft. The captain's name, Carol would also learn later, was Adaeze Nwosu, 12 years on the line, based in Charlotte, a woman who ran a tight and courteous cabin and who had been listening, in the forward galley, since Webb came back from the aisle. She came out once. She looked at row 2, and at Hartwell, and at Marcus Webb standing in the aisle, still looking at Darnell Osei, the way you look at someone you thought you might not see again. And then she went back to the cockpit, and Bryce Hartwell was asked, quietly and without scene, to spend the remainder of the flight in the aft galley, while a colleague managed the forward service. They pushed back 11 minutes later. When they reached altitude and the seatbelt sign went off, Captain Nwosu came on the PA. She thanked the passengers for their patience during the boarding delay. She said there had been a situation that had been resolved, and that she wanted to personally acknowledge a passenger in row 2, a retired Master Sergeant of the United States Army, a decorated Special Forces veteran, a man who had spent 22 years in service to his country, and thank him for his patience and his composure. She said she was honored to have him on her flight. What happened in the forward cabin then was not loud. It did not begin all at once. It began in the row behind Darnell Osei, where a man about his own age put his hands together and spread from there. The woman in 3B was not among them, and Carol noted this. Noted it the way you note a thing you know you'll carry, until most of the forward cabin was applauding, quietly. the way people applaud when they're not quite sure they deserve to be in the room. Darnell Osei looked at the seat back in front of him. He did not turn around. He did not nod or smile in the way people smile when they've received a compliment. He sat with his hands on his knee for a moment, and then he reached up and pressed the call button, and, when the attendant came, he asked, in the same low-level voice he had used for everything else, for a cup of coffee, black, no sugar. Carol watched him and she thought, that is what 22 years looks like. That is what it costs and what it makes. A man who does not need the room to applaud because he has never needed the room for anything. She picked up her magazine. She did not read it. She sat with it in her hands and watched the clouds move past the oval window and thought about the moment she had not spoken and the moment she finally had, and the distance between them, which was not very far in minutes and felt very far in everything else. Marcus Webb came by, once, on his way forward, and paused at the row. He looked at Darnell Osei the way, Carol found herself thinking this, the way someone looks at a door they once had to carry everyone through. He said something, low, that Carol didn't catch. Darnell answered in 2 words, and Webb nodded and went back to the cockpit. The airline's review of the incident opened 3 days after the flight. The cabin conduct report, filed jointly by Captain Nwosu and the second attendant, documented the secondary ID request, the complaint from 3B, and the escalation pattern. Bryce Hartwell was removed from forward cabin duty pending the outcome. The review was extended to include complaint records over the preceding 14 months from the Terminal C gate rotation. The woman in 3B was not named in any official document. Her complaint was noted. Carol wrote a statement. She had not been asked to, but she found the airline's customer relations address and wrote one anyway, 2 paragraphs in plain language about what she had seen and how long she had waited before she said anything. She sent it. She did not hear back, which she expected, and which was appropriate. She had not written it for a response. She had written it because it was the thing she should have done at the beginning, and she wanted it to exist somewhere as proof that she had done it, even late. Darnell Osei drank his coffee at 31,000 feet. He watched the country below him, the brown and gold and pale green of it, the rivers cutting through. And he thought about the quiet, ordinary things a man thinks about at altitude when he has spent enough time in places where the sky was the only open space available. He thought about the drive from the airport. He thought about dinner. He had been asked to move from a seat he had purchased, in a cabin he had every right to be in, by a man who had looked at him and decided something was wrong before a word was spoken. It had happened before. It would, probably, happen again. The outcome would not always be a co-pilot who knew his name walking down the aisle. He had made his peace with that long ago. The way you make peace with terrain. You learn to move through it with your hands on your knee, and your voice at the same level, going in as coming out. And you do not give anyone the satisfaction of the alternative. The clouds broke over the mountains, and the sun came through the window at an angle that caught the side of his face, and Carol, who was not reading her magazine, watched it happen, and thought that he looked, in that moment, exactly like what he was, a man who had already paid for everything the room was only now getting around to noticing.